folks. Welcome to today's Brownbag. It's great to see such a great turnout on such a beautiful day out there. I do want to make mention before I introduce our speaker today, right after spring break, on which of course we won't have a Brownbag, but on the Monday, directly after, we're going to be bringing in our Bacchus lecture. And so I just want to give you notice of that. It'll be Monday, March 23rd. And it'll be Antoni Polonsky from Budapest University who will be speaking on the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, a new approach to the history of Jews in Poland. And then, of course, he will, the next day, speak at the Brownbag as well on a similar topic. Our lecturer today is the 2015 Plokhii lecturer, Serhii Plokhii from Harvard. He's the Mykhailo Hrushevskyi Professor of Ukrainian History there. I want to take a moment to thank the family of Michael and Lubomir Plokhii, who continue to support Ukrainian studies here at KU. Dr. Plokhii has written extensively on a variety of topics related to her area, on Ukraine and on Russia. And yesterday, if you missed it, he gave a fascinating lecture on the events and discussions surrounding the dissolution of the USSR in the 1990s. And today, he has agreed to sort of take that and apply it to what's going on there today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bart. And let me see whether our wonderful technology works, because the images are on the screen of the laptop, and I wonder whether we can put it on the screen for everyone.
I'll have it up momentarily.
Okay, good. I don't know, I used to give lectures and seminars without any images at all. And now I see that it's becoming more and more difficult. On the one hand, image is a great thing. On the other, I think about my own lectures and talks. They are just reduced to the commentary on the image and on the picture. So we'll see. Whether we'll have today a seminar or not depends on whether we'll get the image.
Grab the
okay, we got
right behind you, maybe the middle one off as well.
Good, thank you. Well, I like this image very much in the sense that it allows me to start lecture, presentation, talk on today's situation while still being rooted in history, and as you know from the introduction, I'm a historian. So I'm a little bit of imposter, and I pretend that I can comment on current events. So my take on the current situation is really very much informed by history, and in this particular case, recent history of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm really very happy to see in the audience some of the people who attended my talk yesterday. But for the benefit of those who didn't attend, I'll walk you through a couple of images and will summarize what I was saying there in really few short minutes. Because again, my reading and interpretation of the collapse of the Soviet Union very much informs also my reading and my take on the current situation. So the collapse of the Soviet Union I treat in the context of the disintegration of the world empires, which can be viewed as one of the major processes and number of events of the history of the 20th century. I look at the collapse of the Soviet Union primarily as a result of inability of Russian and Ukrainian elites to agree on the modus vivendi for continuing in one state, something that came to the fore in the fall of 1991. And I treat the events of the coup in Moscow as not just one act play, but at least two act plays. The first act is something that we all, or those of us who were around, saw on TV screens. So that was the attempt of the hardliners around Gorbachev to take over control of the Soviet Union from him, and that attempt failed. And then there was a second act, and that was an act that is called by someone as counter-coup. That was more successful, but not completely successful attempt by Boris Yeltsin and the Russian leadership to take power away from Gorbachev. And to a degree they succeeded, so he's much less powerful after the coup than he was before that, and that power, it just didn't disappear anywhere. It went to the office of the Russian president, and in the fall of 91 there were two presidents in Kremlin, Russian and Soviet. Ukraine, in this interpretation of events, is a key player in the drama of the fall of the Soviet Union. The referendum of December 1st, 1991 spells the end not only for the Ukrainian presence in the Union, continuing participation in the Union structure, but also end to the Union as such. 1 week after the Ukrainian referendum, the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian heads of state decide to dissolve the Soviet Union. What that was facilitated was the decision of the Russian leadership that was made earlier to start very radical economic reform, for which other republics were not ready, and the Russian leadership again didn't give up on the political union, but certainly was providing its own economic policy, and then the union comes to an end after the Belarusian agreement between three leaders of the Slavic states. Now, answering one of the questions that I got yesterday, said that on the one hand we have a very specific date of the end of the Soviet Union, and this is the 25th of December of 1991, but on the other hand this is also the starting date for the process that is called the disintegration of the Union, and that process lasted for at least another 8 years, until the end of the decade, until 1990s. And it is here in earnest that we really start the story of today's Ukraine crisis. One of the headlines that appeared almost immediately after the Russian annexation of the Crimea were the headlines dealing with the Budapest Memorandum. And Budapest Memorandum, that was something that was signed in 1994, and according to that memorandum, the governments of the Russian Federation, of the United States of America, Great Britain, and France and China, their commitment was less substantial, but certainly those three countries, they, in the language of that document, didn't guarantee but gave assurances regarding the territorial integrity of Ukraine and integrity of the Ukrainian borders. That was happening in 1994, at the time also when the final decision was reached that the nuclear arsenal will be transferred not only from Belarus and Kazakhstan, but also from Ukraine. The nuclear warheads would be transferred, and not anywhere, not to the US, not to France, not to China, but to Russia. The headlines, of course, and the questions that were asked, okay, if that happened to Ukraine, what kind of message this situation sends to North Korea, to Iran? So if you give up your nuclear arsenal and then one of the guarantors, so the states that gave assurance to your sovereignty, then violates that sovereignty, what incentive the rest of the world has to give up arms? Well, what happened in '94, and you see here very young at that time, President Clinton and President Yeltsin and President Kravchuk of Ukraine, was really a continuation of the story that started in 1990 and '91. The security of the nuclear arsenals was one of the major concerns for the American administration in 1990 and '91. One of the major reasons why the Bush administration actually kept supporting the continuing existence of the Soviet Union and kept supporting Gorbachev all the way into late November of 1991. And it was then in '91, including in the telephone conversation that Boris Yeltsin had with President Bush with Plokhii from Belarus, that assurances were given that actually the command of a strategic military forces, the command of the nuclear arsenal will be in Moscow, will be centered in Moscow. In December, Secretary Baker visited Kremlin and met with Yeltsin, and again, at the top of his agenda was the security of the nuclear arsenal. He said, how in the world are you going to assure that? And he said, well, the Ukrainians and Kazakhs and Belarusians, they don't understand that. They will have a telephone, but what that really means that I would have to consult with them, but really the control of the nuclear arsenals will be with me and with the Minister of Defense of Russia. And that's actually how it was. So theoretically, the control of the nuclear arsenals had all the presidents of these nuclear republics, but in reality, as Yeltsin said, they really had they had the right to express their opinion on whether to fire the nuclear arms or not, but really didn't have control over that arsenal. Well, for Ukraine, it was a major question what to do with the nuclear arsenal and with strategic forces in general on that territory. Original approach was that we will, I interviewed the former Minister of Defense, General Konstantin Morozov, and he said, well, the idea was that we would keep that under Moscow control. And then he says that the turning point for him was when Henry Kissinger visited him. And they had this conversation, and Kissinger was kind of half asleep after this flight. And Morozov was telling him what the vision is, what the plans are, and that will be under control of Moscow. And Kissinger wakes up and says, and what is then independence? And Morozov said that was a key thing for him. So he realized that there could be independence of the country if the Russian the Russian troops and in particular control over the nuclear arms would be in Ukraine. So the decision was reversed in a sense that the Ukraine would get rid of its nuclear arsenal. So the idea was that it's better to send the nukes to Russia than to have Russians control the nukes on the territory of Ukraine. And this long negotiations where Ukraine managed to get substantial support, financial support from the West and from the United States in particular, ended in '94. And later the Budapest Memorandum was signed as well. Well, according to the Budapest Memorandum, Russia gave assurances, not guarantees, to the non-violating of the Ukrainian sovereign territory. But in reality, the negotiations on the borders and negotiations on the fate of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol continued all the way until '97. It was only in '97 that Yeltsin and Kravchuk signed an agreement on Russia recognizing the borders of Ukraine not now as a union republic, but as a sovereign state. And Ukraine gives lease rights to the Russian Black Sea Fleet for, it seems to me at that point it was 25 years, so the lease was supposed to come to an end in 2014. The recognition of Ukraine in its borders as of '91 was a controversial issue in Ukraine back in '91. I was talking about that a little bit in my yesterday's lecture, and it was equally controversial issue in '97. So it took the Russian parliament 2 years to debate the issue and finally actually give its approval to this agreement. So '99, in a way, we can look at as possible date, the final date of disintegration of the Soviet Union. The borders are recognized, in particular in relations between Russia and Ukraine. So they found the formula for the continuing presence of the Russian Black Sea Fleet on the territory of Crimea, and so on and so forth. Well, in the 1990s, generally the policy in Russia changed from very pro-Western policy associated with Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, who was close to Yeltsin from the very beginning, to the situation with the financial crisis, disappointment in the West over the handling of the Yugoslavia crisis. And what you see is coming to the fore in Russian foreign policy a new group of leaders associated with Vitaly Primakov, who became prime minister for a short period of time in the late 1990s. And that policy was actually the policy of, as it was stated in Russia, putting Russia's interest first. That actually the role of Russia is not anymore to be a junior partner in relations with the United States, but Russia is there to take care of its own interests, and then if those interests coincide with the interests of the West, then work together, if not, to take a position that would oppose the West. The most dramatic moment was when Primakov turned his plane flying to the United States. He did that over Atlantic on the issue of the NATO bombing of Serbia. So that was a symbolic gesture that really identified turn in the Russian foreign policy. I had a chance to talk to a number of U.S. diplomats who were active in relations in dealing with Russia in the 1990s. And one thing that they told me that at all the points, irrespective of who was in the office of the foreign minister, Russia generally was quite accommodating when it comes to American interests all over the world, with one exception. And that exception was the post-Soviet space. So, in a matter of speaking, when we talk about the end of the Cold War, and now there is a lot of talk about the return of the Cold War. Well, the Cold War didn't end in '91. It ended on many levels really in December of 1989 during Bush and Gorbachev's negotiations at Malta. But they ended in most parts of the world. The Cold War in the post-Soviet space never ended. So what we see now is actually it getting into a different stage, stopping being cold and becoming more and more hot. So Russian position and Russian vision from the very beginning was going back to the Yalta. Let's divide the world into the spheres of influence. Let's have the post-Soviet space our exclusive sphere of influence. That started very early on under Kozyrev on the issue of Moldova and conflicts in Central Asia. Russians were saying that we want to provide the peacekeeping forces. This is our sphere of influence, our sphere of responsibility. And that what actually went, of course, and continues to go against completely the American and Western vision of the post-Cold War world, which is, from the Western point of view and perspective, this is a vision that is not sphere of influence, but there are international organizations and work should be conducted through international organizations. Well, and very often it is portrayed that way, that, okay, there is Russia with its vision, later become known as multipolar world, there are United States of America, and maybe it's just easier to give Russians what they want and not to provoke any further conflicts. Well, what is missing in this picture, and what is missing in this argument, is actually the peoples, the countries, the leaderships of the countries of the post-Soviet space. So what this argument means is that we are thinking in the great power politics of 19th century and 20th century. These are American interests and these are Russian interests. Well, what about Kazakh interests, Uzbek interests, Turkmen interests, Ukrainian interests? it would be fair to say that actually finding answer to this question right away, it's a difficult task. These countries are new countries, without actually well-established tradition of statehood, without elites that can formulate that very clearly, without very often consensus. So think about the interwar Europe and Eastern Europe and the countries that emerged on the ruins of the Habsburg and Ottoman Empire and partly Russian Empire. So you deal with that kind of in historical terms, with that kind of situation. But what is very clearly is that none of these countries actually wants the world to think about their region in terms of great power politics. They all want their voice to be heard and their opinion taken into account. President Putin comes to power in, please correct me, was it 2000, right? Yeah, Boris Yeltsin believed that that was the beginning of the new millennium. Now we know that it wasn't, but it was certainly the new era and the new beginning in Russian politics. It wasn't as kind of a drastic as in terms of the change as we would say today, looking at the long array kind of a presence of Putin in Kremlin. But again, the idea was the same, that Putin was looking for partnership with the West. Putin was looking for partnership with the United States. The prize was, of course, the free hand in the post-Soviet space. And that message was not really received very well in the West. So what you see already during the Putin's presidency is that Russia becomes actually much more assertive in terms of its foreign policy in the so-called near abroad. And Ukraine, the republic on issue of whose vote the Soviet Union fell apart in '91, and Russia decided not to continue with the Union experiment after Ukraine was out, again becomes a central issue for the Russian program of reintegration of the post-Soviet space. In connection with the current crisis, very often we hear the words that actually Putin wants to restore the Russian Empire. Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. He says that he doesn't. And actually I trust him on that. He's not going to bring back the Russian Empire. He's not going to bring back the Soviet Union. Russia opted out of the Soviet Union because it was too expensive of an enterprise. So today's Russian vision is actually much more, in economic terms, it's a cheaper way of controlling the space in military and political and other terms. The vision is construction of a Eurasian Union, starting with the customs union, so basically not occupying the territory per se. So from that point of view, the case of Crimea is more an exception from the Russian policy, and the case of Donbass and Eastern Ukraine would be more in line of what Russia wants or what Russia doesn't want, and that means actually looking for the ways how to control the post-Soviet space in economic, military terms, and if they're moving too much toward the West, or maybe getting too cozy with China, potentially in the future, again, then the military force is used to deal with those issues. Well, these are the images of the Orange Revolution, and we know for sure the fact who is behind the poisoning of Yushchenko is still up in the air, but we know for sure that, of course, Russia was very much involved in the events of the Orange Revolution, supporting publicly and not so publicly the candidate whom they believed was pro-Russian, and that was Mr. Yanukovych. The loss of Yanukovych in the third round of elections was perceived in Kremlin as really Western conspiracy against Russia. All of that were technologies of Western secret services, and Russia decided that actually it would wait and look for different ways to deal with this situation when the countries of the post-Soviet space actually don't buy into the vision of the world presented by the US and European Union, and are eager to join European Union, but actually are more than reluctant to join any international organization that especially when it comes to economy, created by Russia. Well, the game really changes in 2008. So for the first time in 2008, we see the Russian troops actually are marching across the borders of the Russian Federation. Russia is a society that was in the state of war since the very time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's already in November of '91 that first Russian troops are sent into Chechnya. There are two Chechen wars. There is a continuing counter-terrorist operation today in Chechnya. So from that point of view, it's really very important to keep in mind that current Russian society is a society shaped by the experience of the war and of the loss of the empire, much more than it is shaped by the experience of short period of liberal democracy and associated with perestroika and early years of Yeltsin's rule. The reason for, or at least one of the reasons for going to Georgia is to send West a message that Russia will not accept Ukraine's or Georgian membership in the European Union. Because what you see, for example, in Ukraine after the Orange Revolution with President Yushchenko, it's actually a shift toward the West, attempt to join the European Union, and also the start of preliminary negotiations on possible invitation to NATO. And that was setting up the new rules of the game. So West gets the message, in particular the presidential administration of Barack Obama, and the membership for Georgia and for Ukraine in the NATO is off the table. What Russia says at this point is that, okay, EU is okay, EU is fine, but no NATO. So that's the line, and that's the position of 2008. And then come the new crisis and the events of 2013. When you sometimes watch American TV, and especially if you're lucky or unlucky to get and listen to Stephen Cohen, he's the most kind of he articulates the position maybe the best. His line is that what is happening in Ukraine today is basically Russia's reaction to the extension of NATO. And it is very much Western fault. West is pushing NATO, Russia has to defend itself, and of course Putin is not a nice guy, but actually West has to share the responsibility for that. Well, there is one problem, at least in my eyes, with this kind of an argument. NATO is off the table since 2008. The events in Ukraine start not even over the issue of joining European Union. These demonstrations and then the coming of the new government and so on and so forth is over the issue of lousy association agreement with European Union. So it's not about NATO, it's not about joining EU, it is about association agreement with EU. Why we see such reaction on the part of Russia? Well, one way to look at that interpretation is that Russia is not anymore trying to stop NATO or EU. The new task of Russia is actually to create this Eurasian Union, customs union, so to create a bloc, trade, economic, political, military bloc, that would be on par with rising China and with the European Union that is becoming stronger and stronger. So it's reintegration of the post-Soviet space. And from that point of view, of course, the association agreement with EU, it doesn't put Ukraine into NATO, it doesn't put Ukraine into European Union, but it precludes or makes much more difficult the process of integration or reintegration of Ukraine into the Soviet space. And this is the stakes are high enough for that kind of game and for that kind of thinking to get involved in events in Ukraine. Well, in the last few days we got a lot of interesting information, including from President Putin himself, about the time when the decision to invade or annex Crimea was taken. Apparently it was the night of the 23rd of February of 2014. This is probably true in one way, in the sense that the final decision was made. But basically most of the observers believe that the operation was in preparation for a long period of time. One take on that is that this thinking, they started thinking those terms after the events of the Orange Revolution and after 2008, in case Ukraine joins NATO, then that was Plan B, but then it was implemented in February. What we know, not from President Putin, but from one of the major players in the Ukrainian drama, including the former colonel of Russian Secret Service, I don't remember which one, Igor Strelkov, who was really a key figure in the events in Donbass in the spring and summer of 2014, is that Strelkov and his people were in the Crimea already on the 20th of February. Before that, Strelkov was in Kiev at the time of the Maidan. Current Ukrainian government actually accuses, and this is on a very high level, that was stated by President Poroshenko of Ukraine, that the massacre on Maidan was started by the Russian snipers, or snipers that came from Russia. And astounding accusation is that they were coordinated by the aide to the, or assistant to President Putin, Vladislav Surkov. That was the statement of the president. He said that the Ukrainian Secret Service has proof of that. We don't know that. One thing that I can say at this point is that probably Poroshenko had some reasons to believe in that, because otherwise, given his relations with the West and really dependence on the current Ukrainian government on the West, it's difficult to imagine for me him kind of a risk, taking that kind of a risk and making a statement that is false. The events of the Orange, first of the Orange Revolution and then of this new Maidan, are looked from and viewed from Russia as basically something that is arranged, financed, supported from the West, and is directed against Russia. And in that logic of events, then Russia actually is the country that is not invading, not annexing, not conducting a hybrid war, but the country that is defending itself against the approaches of the West. Well, the Russian involvement in Ukraine in the context of Maidan was not just military. So we see a major propaganda effort, not only in Russia but also all over the world. And again, this map, it is not the product of Russia. It's the product of I don't know who is putting together these maps, but it's I am showing it for one reason, and this is for this Eurofascists you can see here. So the basically a concerted effort to present the popular protest on Maidan in downtown Kyiv as not as a democratic movement, but as a nationalist movement, anti-Semitic movement, and basically fascist movement. And again, this is very much part of the current Ukraine crisis and very much part of the war, which led the Ukrainian government to create a Ministry of Information to counter this attacks. And the decision that was extremely controversial in Ukraine, despite the fact that country is in a state of war, there were very strong opponents to the idea that the government should be involved and should control the information, even for the purposes of the war effort. Now, what would be the game plan in general, and what we can expect from the situation in Ukraine? The event started with the Crimea, and we can talk about Crimea a little bit later. So the model in the Crimea was that it's the covered but military operation, basically, in which the special forces take over control over government buildings. Then they control the meeting of the parliament, which has or doesn't have quorum. And then there is election of the new leadership, and then blocking of the Ukrainian military units on the locations where they're situated, and finally having a referendum that the world actually can't verify. So the observers are not allowed there. The transmission of the Ukrainian channels is cut off, and then annexation of the Crimea. The model for the rest of Ukraine was quite different. The model was not annexation, but basically splitting Ukraine in half and creating a new state that would be economically and politically viable. And that state, the map was drawn more or less along the linguistic boundaries in Ukraine, with east and south becoming a potentially new state, which would be called New Russia, Belarusia. New Russia was the name of the province that existed in the 18th century. It didn't cover all of this territory. It covered the territory immediately north of the Crimea. The destabilization of the situation started in Kharkiv. Odessa was another major target. But the place where it really worked was the Donbass. There is a number of reasons why it worked in Donbass and why it didn't work in Odessa and in Kharkiv, and there is a number of levels of explanation. We can talk about the role of individuals. For example, the Minister of Interior, Avakov, who is himself from Kharkiv and was able to contain the situation there on a certain level. We can look at the ethnic map of Ukraine and find that Crimea is the place where the ethnic Russians constitute the majority, and Donbass is the area where ethnic Russians constitute plurality, not majority, but plurality. And the idea of the new Russia, as it was presented by people like Borodai, who was the prime minister of the Donetsk Republic, political consultant from Moscow, or Mr. Girkin, whom I already mentioned, a retired officer in the security service. That idea was really closely associated with the Russian world. So it was about Russian culture, about Russian language. It was civilizational. There is a conflict between the Russian civilization and Western civilization. From that point of view, looking at the ethnographic map, okay, that effort got most of the traction in the places where the ethnic Russians constituted either majority or significant portion of the population. There is also another explanation looking at the Crimea and Donbass, also at the areas that were fared the worst maybe compared to other regions of Ukraine when it comes to the economic transition. Crimea was hit really very hard in the 1990s, and it continues to hurt today with not the fall of the Soviet Union, not the creation of the independent Ukraine, but by the end of the Cold War. Once the Russians and Ukrainians got the possibility to travel for vacation to Turkey and to Mediterranean and to Adriatic, where the tourist season is much longer, where the investment actually brings back, where it's cheaper and the quality of the service is higher, Crimea fell really on hard times. And basically the main investment that was coming there was not in this mass tourist industry, but more like oligarchs, Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs, buying pieces of land on the shore. Donbass is a classic, of course, Rust Belt of the Soviet Union. Most of these industrial enterprises come from 1930s, 1950s. There are major problems with the production of coal, because it is still there, but it is so deep that it's cheaper actually to buy it somewhere else than produce it in Donbass. So what we see here is a combination of a number of factors. What was not mentioned by me was the factor of the failure of Ukrainian state and Ukrainian society to fully integrate those regions in Ukraine, which really brings me to another theme, and it's the theme of the impact that the current crisis, first Maidan, and then the war has on the Ukrainian society. The vision that was associated with the creation of New Russia, the project of New Russia that at this point failed. We don't know, maybe it will be brought back in the next few months, we'll have to see. But the basic idea behind the idea of New Russia is that Ukraine is a country that is not just between East and West. Ukraine is the country that is profoundly divided. And that division is basically represents itself. It's cultural and it's historical and otherwise, but it best represents itself when you look in geographic terms, in terms of the Russian language as the language of convenience versus Ukrainian language, and that map that I was showing you before is really indicative of that. Well, the shock of the annexation and then the war in Ukraine produced a very interesting result in today's Ukrainian society. The society is still divided, but we see a really mobilization around the idea, which I would call basically patriotic idea of defense of your country, which crosses the ethnic and cultural and linguistic lines. Well, you look at it, the main heroes of Ukraine today. I mentioned Mr. Avakov, the Minister of Interior, who some say saved Kharkiv, who is an Armenian. You look at another major figure who became the Ukrainian oligarch, who became the governor of Dnipropetrovsk region in southern Ukraine, close to Donbass, Mr. Kolomoisky, who is a Jew. And you look at the Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian volunteers fighting the war in Donbass, the operational language is Russian. So the war in Donbass, which is portrayed, or at least from one side is portrayed as this civilizational war, as this cultural and linguistic war, is fought in Russian on both sides. Which basically raises a number of questions about, interesting from the point of view of sociology and people who study language and history as well, in terms of this formation of a new type of identity that crosses linguistic and cultural and other boundaries in Ukraine.